Well, good afternoon to all of you on the East Coast. I am Paul Peterson. The purpose of our discussion today is to present some of the key findings and recommendations that have been released by the Hoover Education Success Initiative at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. I am a professor at the Harvard University and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. I have four distinguished panelists with me to discuss the main features of the report, and I will introduce them as we go along. We look very much forward to your questions, and we'll get to them before we finish in this hour. So please write them in the box for Q&A or for the chat function, whichever you decide. And I will ask Christopher Ruskowski to make sure we get all of your questions posed, or at least as many of them as possible. CR, as we call him, is the former superintendent of education for the state of New Mexico, and he's the executive director of this initiative at Hoover. But before we get into the discussion, I'll just give you some of the key findings from this report. So the report itself is based on 4 research papers, and we have 2 people who participated in writing these research papers, Anna Egalite and Matthew Chingos, here today. So you can ask them questions about their areas of expertise. Anna Egalite wrote on charters, and Chingos wrote on segregation and school choice. And I want to also emphasize that this report is just one of 4 that have been released. There are one on teacher compensation, one on graduation requirements, and one on school accountability. So before turning over to the panel, I just want to emphasize that we have in this report a statement of 4 principles. Now I hear some noise in the background. Can you all mute yourself? Thank you. So there are certain principles that we think are very important for school choice to move forward. And one of them is that we should not have our own favorite kind of school choice, but we should have multiple forms of school choice, whether it's within the district or between districts or charter schools or private school choice or tax credits or education savings accounts. We should have a big tent. The future lies in creating a big tent and forming broad coalitions. The second point is that families' choice of school should not be distorted by fiscal policy. That requires some elaboration, but it's a basic principle. Facilitate desegregation. School choice will fail if it facilitates segregation. It must keep its focus on creating as many interracial, interethnic opportunities as possible. And we should, in the future, focus more on secondary education. And we should recognize in these days of COVID that school systems have to be nimble. They need to change, and that's all the more reason to have school choice. So we begin with a basic point that we've had school choice for a long time, but it's been tied to real estate, and that has produced economic and racial segregation. That's the main reason why we need to have school choice of a new and more equitable form. Although new forms of school choice have arrived on the scene, whether they're within the district, like the magnet schools, other forms of district choice, or whether they're private schools or charter schools or vouchers or homeschooling, or the kind of choice that comes from people just picking a neighborhood to attend the school they want. So half the people in the United States are now attending a school of choice, if you include all those who explicitly say they picked their school by moving to a neighborhood. Well, in these days of COVID, I thought it would be useful for you all to know that, in fact, the private and charter sectors are doing a much better job of moving. This was last spring when schools first moved to online learning and most schools closed, it was the private and the charter schools where teachers were meeting with the whole class several times a week. The district schools were behind. The district schools are in that gray bar, the private schools, the green bar, and the charters, the yellow bar. And you had higher levels of satisfaction in the private and charter schools than in the district schools. And new material was being introduced more frequently rather than just doing a reviewing of old material, which is what a quarter of the district schools were doing as late as May in the early part of this year. So we don't have data yet on the fall, but we're going to have data on the fall from Education Next in another 2 weeks or so. So stay tuned to find out whether or not the charter and private sectors remain the more nimble sectors as we move into the second stage of the COVID pandemic. But I also want to present to you some data that's recently been released, and it's data from the National Assessment of Education Progress, which the data we analyzed, Danny Shaquille and I analyzed this data, and we found that the charter sector was making more improvement between 2005 and 2017 than was the district sector. And we have data from throughout the United States. It's representative for each state and for the country as a whole. We have 4 million tests for district students and over 40,000 tests for charter students over this period of time. And we find that at the charters and math, kids are learning 6 months more than they were in 2005. The cohort progress has been 6 months further ahead than in the district sector, and 2 months in reading and at the 4th grade level. And the gains are especially large for African Americans. So it's one of the key arguments for school choice is that this sector is improving. There are all the signs are that especially for African Americans, charter schools have gotten a lot better between 2005 and 2017, particularly in math, but also reading, particularly at the 8th grade level, but also at the 4th grade level. So it's not then surprising that parents in the charter sector are more satisfied than those in the district sector. The charter sector is the yellow bar, the district, the green bar. And then the private sector, parents are even more satisfied. So, you know, people pay for their education if they go to a private school, and they wouldn't go if they weren't very satisfied with that school. So we do find that the black bar, which shows the level of satisfaction in the private sector, is by far the longest bar in this screen. And this is true for all different kinds of aspects of a school. There's teacher quality, school discipline, academic expectations, safety, character instruction, and the like. One of the issues that comes up is whether or not the private sector and the charters provide civic education, whether they teach tolerance, or whether they're a divisive force. And there's really no evidence to support that. On the contrary, the evidence is in the opposite direction. We discussed that in the report as well. One of the things that's clear is that the tax credit program in Florida has had a beneficial effect on the program participants as well as on the schools in which they are located. And this is important because one of our recommendations is that we should really focus on the tax credit program as a particularly promising form of school choice. Most recently, we have a study by Professor Winters at Boston University, and he finds that the effects of charters on schools in the district sector has been positive nationwide. This is a study of the nationwide effects of charters on district school performance in math and reading. And he focuses on the places where charter growth has been the largest, and he finds positive effects on the district sector. And he finds that there's been no statistically significant financial impact. That's an issue that you hear a lot. And we see, he reports out that there's very little evidence for that, as have other studies. So there's much more we have many more findings. This is sort of a sample, but I want to leave time for our panel. But what I would like to mention in conclusion are just some of our recommendations. We focus on tax credits. They're popular. People like them. The program has had positive effects. It doesn't have constitutional problems. The recent Supreme Court decision is very favorable to tax credits. This is an issue which has got broad public support from both political parties. It should be an issue that we can move forward in the next decade. We suggest that universal vouchers might be the way to go. I know this is not the way things have gone in the past, but the public is as supportive of universal vouchers as targeted vouchers. And if you're going to keep choice from creating segregation, you don't want to have a policy that segregates poor kids in separate schools. And that's what targeted policies can do. And universal policies like Social Security have been much more popular than targeted programs such as age-dependent children or the Medicaid program. We advocate comprehensive transportation systems where everybody in a district is transported by the district and the state covers the cost. It seems to me this is a cost legitimately covered by the state, and so the group recommends that. We also recommend a comprehensive special education policy, not worrying about which sector has the most students who are in need of special education, but make sure that all sectors are providing opportunities for families who need to have that kind of special assistance for their child. We encourage a common enrollment system that the district and the charter schools and the private sector too, if possible, should join together so that it's easy for parents to choose across these sectors. And we encourage the private sector, both those that are voucher programs, but especially charters, make sure you bring in minority entrepreneurs if you're going to have a successful coalition of support moving forward. All right, so I will end it with that and stop the slideshow. If somebody can figure out how to stop the slideshow for me. I will then move on to our panelists to get their comments. And so let me begin with you, Wayne. Can you were the commissioner in the state of Kentucky. You're now a dean at Belmont College in Nashville, Tennessee. Congratulations on your new position. I hope you have enjoyed this easy, relaxed entry into your new job. But as commissioner, you had a tough time in Kentucky from the point of view of the school choice movement, because Kentucky, you would have thought, would have been one of the places where we could have moved forward with school choice. What were the challenges? What are the challenges in that state? And what are the arguments that are being raised there? And how can research help move the needle in Kentucky?
Well, thank you, Paul. Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here as part of the conversation. The belief for me that drove my work in Kentucky and continues to drive my work is that every school, I believe, should be a school of choice. Now that doesn't mean every school should be a charter school. It doesn't mean every school should be a private school. It means that every school that a child attends ought to be one where the parents, where the family believes that's the best place for their kid to go to school, even if that means their child is attending a locally assigned school. For parents in Kentucky, they're not different than parents anywhere else in the country. They want options. They want choices. They want to be able to choose schools and programs that are best for their kids. As some of you may remember, in 2017, the Kentucky General Assembly actually passed charter school legislation. Was the last state, I believe, to actually pass a charter school law. But the political appetite for advancing choice in Kentucky really was not there. That charter school bill only passed by a very slim majority So slim, in fact, that there were not enough votes to pass the version of the bill that included the funding mechanism for charter schools. And so the General Assembly actually stripped out all of the funding pieces of the bill in order to pass the framework of the charter school legislation with a simple majority, with the hopes, the intention that they would return in the subsequent session or a future session and get the funding mechanism into law. That never happened. And truthfully, that never happened because even with supermajorities of the Republican Party in the House and the Senate, and folks on the outside would assume that means there's much more interest in advancing a choice agenda. That has not been the case in Kentucky. That's largely because the Kentucky Education Association has an incredibly strong influence in the General Assembly in Kentucky. The Association of School Superintendents and the School Boards Association have influence as well, but it's really been the Kentucky Education Association's influence that has stopped charter school legislation and tuition tax credit legislation from moving in the General Assembly. The arguments that you hear are the traditional arguments that you hear across the country. First and foremost, funding. The fundamental difference in agreement that whether funding belongs to traditional public school districts versus funding belonging to kids and thus should follow kids to the schools that their parents choose for them. Matt is going to talk a bit about the segregation argument that comes up as well, and the idea that parents who choose schools for their kids sometimes choose schools that are more racially isolated. I don't use the term segregation intentionally, but more racially isolated than schools they would otherwise attend. But with that said, given that there was not enough appetite to move a choice agenda in the General Assembly, when we were there, we worked really hard to move choice in other ways. We didn't give up on moving a bill in the General Assembly, but I see my former board chair is on the call, Hal Heiner. We worked to advance choice in terms of post-secondary opportunities for kids through dual credit and partnership with post-secondary institutions. We worked to expand career and technical education opportunities for kids, those programs of choice. We encouraged and supported local school districts to create choice options for kids within the state. And then the final area, which I think is worthy of lots more consideration and conversation in Kentucky, is inter-district choice. There are 120 counties in Kentucky. Every county has a county school district, but there are 51 additional school districts in Kentucky. So these are smaller districts that reside, that are part of or within the county school districts. And there's a growing number of superintendents, especially superintendents of these smaller independent school districts, who want greater choice. They want families within those counties to be able to choose to send their kids to the smaller independent school districts. And so this is quite honestly the biggest piece of the choice conversation in Kentucky, which has lots of possibilities for moving forward.
Well, thank you, Wayne, for illuminating the challenges in Kentucky. Indiana is a state which has been one of the leaders in this area, and we're fortunate to have with us on the panel today Robert Behning, who is the chair of the House Education Committee in the state of Indiana, and who has done so much to lead the charge that has been so successful. So, Chairman Behning, thank you for joining us today. And can you tell us some things about why it's worked out? What are the challenges that you face? What are the issues that come up that you're facing now, and how can research play a role in responding to them?
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for including me, and thank you to Hoover for the engagement that we've had over the last several years. Indiana is probably not dramatically different than Kentucky, other than we are much farther ahead. But part of it has been because of leadership and because of changes in the way Indiana funds schools. We began a charter fight back in the 90s and finally got charters on the state's agenda when we actually negotiated away some rights that had been taken away from the state's largest school district, Indianapolis Public Schools, in exchange for giving some of those collective bargaining rights back, we were able to start our charter school movement in 2001. But probably the greatest opportunity that has been afforded to Indiana was in 2006 and 7 when Governor Daniels was governor. We shifted the way we fund schools. Historically, we had funded schools where it was a blend of property taxes and state revenue. The state General Assembly would create our school funding formula, and then we would go ahead and supplement local property tax dollars, which made it very difficult to have inter-district transfers. In 2006, we changed that. We raised sales tax by 1%, and the state funds all of the general fund obligations of our traditional public schools and charter schools. So it became very easy then for us to open choice. And today, the largest choice, as Wayne was saying, the largest choice option is public-to-public choice. We have almost 100,000 students statewide out of our 1.1 million students that are not going to the traditional public school where they have their attendance registered. So, but we've also been, and then 2011, we had a strong Governor Mitch Daniels. We had leadership in both House and the Senate that had a strong commitment to expanding choice even further. And we were able to institute vouchers where Indiana had a voucher law now that was created in 2011 that it gave us the ability to, it was means tested, but if you were up to 200% of free and reduced lunch, you still had an opportunity to participate in our voucher program. We do have stair steps, so it's not, it's a tiered system in terms of support, but you got 90% of the state general fund. Historically, so we have about 30,000 students today in our voucher program, about 60,000 students in our charter programs. We also have tax credits. In 90, I think it was in 2009, we created the state tax credits so that you could use a tax credit that's 50% refundable. So a corporation individuals could contribute to the SGOs, and the SGOs then could fund opportunities for students in non-public schools. We've had caps over the time. We started off, I think, at $5 million. Today, we're at 15 million. So the state matches dollar for dollar your investment. And like I said, business as well as personal state liability is eligible, and it's also refundable. So not refundable, you can carry it over. So if you're not able to use it all in 1 year, you can carry it over to the next. In 2014, we introduced another option called Innovation Network Schools, and that was really because of the leadership of the mayor of Indianapolis and that then Superintendent Louis Farabee at Indianapolis Public Schools, which is kind of a hybrid between charter and a hybrid traditional public school. So Indiana has had the blessing of having a lot of great leaders that have been willing to put political capital on the line. There definitely have been challenges along the way. The teachers union is a strong force. And frankly, the Republican majorities have carried both of all of the choice initiatives in general. But one of the struggles with that, as Wayne has said, is that a lot of the choice occurs in the larger metropolitan areas, which tend not to be represented by Republicans, but more by the minority party. And so a lot of my colleagues, my Republican colleagues, are constantly arguing, why should I take the political heat in my community where choice isn't going to happen? So over time, it continues to be, has become a little bit of a challenge. We are looking forward to the next session, though. We believe we actually expanded majority in the House, and that we have super majorities in both houses, that we actually are looking at going towards more of a universal voucher program and maybe an education savings account for special ed as a way to kind of get our foot in the water in terms of our toe in the water in terms of looking at education savings accounts. So there's been challenges, there's been opportunity. The one thing I will say is the data and research that is available in your report actually helps bolster our efforts to move forward. And COVID actually has also, I think, improved opportunities and actually engaged parents in a much greater way than we would have thought. There's a lot of data out there that suggests that a lot of parents post-COVID will not be sending their student or their child back to the education environment that they were in pre-COVID. And they also have found, as your research would, I think, show that our charter schools and our non-public schools have been more engaged in face-to-face instruction than a lot of our traditional public schools, which I think will actually also bolster some of the support for those. But overall, I think the data is very helpful, and as well as polling data. Polling data indicates, as your information shares, that the public is very excited and thinks universal vouchers should be things that states should look for. And I think primarily because of the fact that we've kind of seen a resurgence of parental engagement with COVID, that they realize, either they realize how difficult it was, how difficult it is to be a at-home parent and quasi-instructor, or they have felt, hey, this has really been beneficial for my child, and I really want to continue that dialogue. So I think you're going to see over time things like pods, micro schools, et cetera, are going to find a proliferation in our communities as we move forward.
Well, thank you, Chairman Behning, for giving us all those details on the success in Indiana and raising some of the issues and thanks for the plug for the research that we've been pulling together. And Anna Egalite played such an important role, and she's a associate professor at North Carolina State University. Anna, do you have any comments on how can the research contribute to this discussion?
For sure. Thank you for being here, and congrats on the final report that HESI released. I think it's a real tour de force that summarizes so much of what has been done in this area, in particular in the charter school literature. I think it's worth noting the growth in the landscape that has occurred. Back in the fall of 2000, we only had just a little bit less than 500,000 students enrolled in charter schools, and that increased sixfold by 2016. So we're looking at about 6% of all kids nationwide in charter schools today, and the experiences that they're having tend to vary based on what part of the country they're in. And the research can inform us in understanding and making sense of what can sometimes appear to be conflicting findings. But once we dig in, I think there's lots more to be learned about the different schooling experiences that they're having. Some of the research evidence in the area of test scores, for example, shows that on average, they're performing about the same, no better, no worse than they would have done in their traditional public school in their assigned district. But the findings, when we dig into the achievement effects literature, really vary depending on the sample that's used in the analysis. For example, if the researchers are only looking at the most popular charter schools, they're tending to find large effects. And there's a reason. Parents are aware that those schools are high quality and delivering on what they're promising. And so there's a waiting list and it's high demand, and that lends itself to a rigorous research design. But if we are able to apply alternative research methodologies that are more representative of all charter schools in a state, then I think that's sobering sometimes for people who want to be very encouraging of charters. And so it's important to keep in mind that the effects are muted when we look at the overall effects. This Credo study of the national landscape, for example, found that learning gains were still positive, but they're very small in reading and null effects in math when we look at a large multi-state sample. Test scores aren't the be-all and the end-all. It's also important to consider the attainment literature that's effects on things like college enrollment, graduation, earnings, and adulthood. And I think it's very encouraging, but it's not uniformly positive. And so the role of research here, I think, is to draw attention to areas where it is highly effective and what can we learn from schools in those areas. So, for example, in Boston, it's very encouraging, the results that we're seeing there, large impacts on students' college preparation and entry, like things like they're taking advanced placement credits at higher rates, enrolling in four-year colleges at higher rates. Similarly, in Chicago, we see a 10 percentage point difference in students who attend charter schools. They're more likely to enroll in college as a result of attending a charter high school. And we can even see, a 12% higher earnings bump by the time students reach age 25 for students who have attended charter schools. So those are really important studies that shed light on the effects outside of just test scores. I think moving forward, it's for a research perspective, it will be really interesting to see how the school choice environment changes as a result of what we've all gone through this past spring. And we've had reference here to learning pods and education savings accounts are a relatively new form of choice that can support that type of learning. I think it will be really interesting to see if we observe an expansion of homeschooling. In my state, where I'm based in North Carolina, early in the pandemic, the website to register as a homeschooling family crashed back in March as soon as all of the schools shut down. And pod learning and what kind of virtual support can be provided for that. So it's a moment of great opportunity, and I hope that the research can keep pace with those developments.
All right, well, thank you, Anna. We also have with us Matthew Chingas, who is the director of the Center on Data and Policy at the Urban Institute, and who has produced the report on school choice and segregation, and has done absolutely the cutting edge literature or analysis in this particular area. So Matt, it's great to have you with us today. Can you address this issue? It comes up in every single discussion of school choice. Is it contributing to segregation? How bad does it, what are the effects? Is it just because minority parents actually prefer the best school regardless of the ethnic composition of the school? What are you finding?
Thanks, Paul. Paul, it's great to be here. I'd start with the point that you opened your presentation with, which is that, we've long had a system of school choice by neighborhood choice in this country, right? And that system, combined with a long history of racist housing policies, has left us with very segregated neighborhoods, which have in turn produced that system of neighborhood choice, and racist policy has given us a system of segregated schools. So really the question we're talking about today, I think, is these choice policies that attempt to empower families with additional opportunities through charter schools or vouchers or tax credit scholarships or what have you. What are they? Do they make that segregation better or worse? And what the review of the literature that Tomas Monares and I did found is that in general, these policies don't seem to be a big contributor. So is that kind of good news or bad news? I think if you hoped that choice policies on their own, by breaking the link between where you live and where to go to school, potentially would have an integrating effect. That doesn't seem to be borne out by the evidence. If anything, in many cases, they seem to add small amounts of well, segregation is a term that's often used. Wayne made the important point that racial isolation is often a more appropriate term to use in some of these discussions. So choice policies don't seem to be a big contributor, but also not a solution on their own. I think the other thing we see is that context and policy design potentially matter a lot here. And we do have examples of choice policies that are designed with encouraging students from different racial and ethnic backgrounds to go to school together, to encourage more school integration. And they do seem to have had some success. Most policies aren't designed with that in mind. They're just designed to provide more opportunities for families. And those policies don't seem to have an integrating effect. And I think a final point to make is to really think about, you hinted at this in your question, Paul, is whose choices are driving these patterns we see. I think we tend to just think, especially those of us researchers who generate all these different segregation indices, you kind of lump everyone in together. And I think it's really important to think differently about the families of affluent, white families who maybe in some cases are choosing to racially isolate themselves. I think that's pretty different from the choices made by low-income families, by Black and Hispanic families who are looking for the best educational opportunities for their children. And if that happens to be in a school that's 85% Black and Hispanic instead of a school that's 81% Black and Hispanic, I don't think I'm going to sit here and judge that decision and say, oh, it's contributing to segregation. It's making things worse. So I think that's something that we don't have a lot of enough research on to really understand. But it's important to think about pulling those apart as we think about designing policies that are really going to empower families in the most effective way possible to produce good educational outcomes, and also not just academic outcomes, but social outcomes and opportunities for children of different backgrounds to attend school together.
Well, thank you, Matthew. I'm going to go back to you, Wayne, and ask for your reaction to this, and especially on this last comment. How do we assess the school choice program. The voucher program originally was developed in many southern states and deliberately to allow for the perpetuation of segregation. Although the movement has, tried to turn that around and has gathered a lot of support in the minority community. Is there still this feeling that the school choice movement is sort of a segregation campaign?
To answer the question, Paul, I think back to a pivotal interview I did when I was doing my dissertation research in North Carolina. It was with an African-American gentleman who was a member of the State Board of Education. And he told me, when the charter school conversation started, I really was not on board, primarily because of the idea of, and he said, increased segregation. And he said what he came to understand as he started to understand the schools in the state a bit more is that many of the efforts that had been made to so-called desegregate schools or to integrate schools had minimal to no impact on the learning of African-American kids. And that to me was so important in that conversation, because it caused me to take a look and think and ask myself some critical questions about how I felt about it as well. I'm of the opinion, to be really clear here, that in the best case scenario, kids are able to go to incredibly rich, diverse schools where they get to know and experience cultures, race, ethnicities, languages from not only all over the country, but all over the world. That's best case scenario. But if I have to choose, and I think this is the case for many African-American parents, if I have to choose between my child going to a diverse school or a school where he or she is going to learn how to read and do math, there's no question. The priority has to be that my kid has to get the basic skills, the preparation that she needs to be successful. If she can do that in a diverse environment, great. If not, I'm going to teach her to read and do math first, and then we'll make sure she gets the diversity on the weekend and after she can read.
Yeah, well said. So, Chairman Behning, let me ask you about, you mentioned the universal voucher idea becoming more popular in Indiana. It seems to me that there's been some danger that targeting vouchers to only poor people is sort of creating schools for poor people, which doesn't sound to me like a very good idea. So can you sort of comment on that?
Sure. Our voucher program starts with 90% of state general fund goes to parents who are 100% of free and reduced lunch or below. So a family of 4, that's $44,000. As I said earlier, if you go, we fund it all the way up to 200% right now, but you only get 50% funding. So we do, which would be about $88,000 for a family of 4. I think the one thing that's become very clear to us, just like early learning, when you focus pre-K, for instance, on early on poverty, parents of poverty only, you have a lot of people who feel disenfranchised, like they pay for the taxes, they should have an option. So as we look, and we are looking at expanding choice, at the same time looking at what does it make sense in terms of accountability, transparency, and maybe consequences for schools, and using choice and engaging parents as a better tool to improve our schools. Parents historically know and want what's best for their kids. I mean, Wayne just referenced, the Black families and how they're going to make choices based on what's best for their children. And we believe that if you expand options, you're going to improve everybody. And that's really kind of played out in Indiana in terms of our voucher program, our universal choice, our overall improvement, not just in our academic success in our choice schools, but actually also in our traditional public schools. So I think choice actually uplifts everyone and not just those who are targeted. But we believe that it is the right way to go moving forward, and our data would support that. I know that Anna had mentioned some of the charter data. Our charter schools, if you look at the charter data, they perform better. 75% of the charter schools in Indiana perform as good as or better than the traditional public schools they're embedded in. And then you have to take out some of the other data that would show that we've had several of our charter schools have had special populations, so have formed around the need of serving diverse and harder to serve students. So you take that out and it even has a greater impact. And I think Credo also had done a study of Indiana charter schools, and we were like 120 days ahead of a traditional public school in language arts, 70 to 80 days in math. So clearly the data indicates that there's support in terms of student achievement on that. But we believe that universal choice does have a lot of appeal across all parties in terms of uplifting all.
If I could jump in.
I would add to that, Chairman Behning, the fact that the charter sector is actually showing greater improvement over time. I mean, when you look at, okay, is a charter school better than the district school at one point in time? That's an interesting question. But more interesting, perhaps, is which sector seems to have the capacity for internal improvement. And the evidence out there is that if it's a bad charter school, it gets shut down. It's much more difficult to shut down a district school. So the charter sector seems to have the capacity built into it of being able to sustain itself through steady improvement over time, especially for minority students, especially for African Americans. But listen, we've been having a great conversation here, but I know you and the audience have questions. So let me turn this over to CR, our moderator for the question and answer period. And CR, do you have some questions that you want to read that have been sent in?
Yeah, I don't know if our audience members know yet, but let's start typing in some questions into the Q&A box. We don't have any typed in yet, Dr. Peterson. But I'm happy to, I'd like to ask a question of Dr. Lewis, Commissioner Lewis, now Dean Lewis, which is, I really want to get more to the core of why the choice/charter movement hasn't gotten the traction in Kentucky that it has in your neighbor of Indiana. I think it's an interesting policy and political thing that deserves a little bit more examination. And then again, audience members, please send in some questions.
Wayne, I know you responded to that in your opening statement, but you know, is it really just that the union is so powerful that it's really almost impossible to bring this to the level of a conversation and a discussion? Or is it the fact that rural communities have so much loyalty to their district schools that you're not going to get representatives from rural areas to support this kind of policy?
It's a combination of the two. And I think those 2 points actually intersect. Kentucky is largely a rural state. And I'll be honest and tell you, you know, as former commissioner of Kentucky, I don't believe charter schools are probably the best reform strategy or choice strategy in lots of communities in Kentucky. I think there are other ways to expand parental choice that might be better for some communities. And so a big part of it is, you're talking about a state that is primarily rural. There is a certain degree of loyalty between legislators, regardless of party, and the local school district. In addition to that loyalty, though, I would say there's politics. There's the understanding that if a legislator, and Chairman Behning could speak to this much more eloquently than I could, if a legislator in a small rural community where the school district is the biggest and most powerful employer in the district, and you have a strong, you know, teachers association, if they decide that they're going to turn on you, and run somebody against you, either in the primary or in the general, it's a very real possibility that you could lose your seat. Now, the part I was never able to truly wrap my head around was legislators who never had the support of the teachers union or the school district really to begin with. And I remember having this conversation with a legislator and asking, what's the concern, what's the fear with supporting choice? One, because you probably wouldn't have charter schools in your community. And two, because you didn't have the support of the teachers union. And he said, but when I run, they don't oppose me really strongly. And so even if it's not the idea that they would lose support, it's the idea, I guess, of how forceful the opposition to their candidacy would be in the election.
Paul, if I can speak to, as a legislator, one of the tools that we use to expand vouchers, because of the same argument, we have a lot of Republican legislators whose largest employers are their local school districts. The way the voucher program was created in 2011, the maximum reimbursement is 90% of the state's general fund. On average, it tends to be about 76% statewide. What we did, the way we created that program, is that the savings revert back to the school funding formula. So when a parent makes a choice in an urban school, the public school, traditional public school in rural Indiana actually got more money per pupil because of the fact that instead of spending 100% of that child in a traditional public school, we were spending on average 76% in a non-public school. So it was a little bit easier way for them to go back home and sell it. Plus, Wayne brings up a great point. I mean, the teachers union does run. I've had primary opponents that have been supported by the teachers union. I think you just have to decide what's in the best interest of kids. And I think over time, you'll have Kentucky legislators probably making the right decision and moving forward on that.
So, Chairman, we do have a question from the audience that I think maybe is a good one to start with you and then to go around the horn on, pertaining to transportation. So to what extent can policymakers help solve issues surrounding equity and integration in school choice programs by providing better access to transportation? And does Indiana, or are we aware of other states or school systems that are providing innovative school transportation solutions to improve choice access for low-income families in particular? So, Chairman, maybe we start with you about how Indiana handles transportation, and then maybe go around the horn to other examples in other places about transportation.
Sure, CR. Great question. I think choice is only a choice if you have a way to get there. So I would argue that transportation tends to be a problem, and still is a problem in Indiana today. In fact, I was on an earlier conference call trying to figure out, is there a way we can do things like consolidating transportation systems county-wide that would provide transportation to any school, any student, regardless of where they want to go. We do have 2 state laws in Indiana, though, that do pertain to charges and vouchers. One, the voucher language or non-public school language, there's been laws on the books probably since I was first elected in '92 or earlier that said if you're a non-public school student that lives along the route of a public school, as public school bus goes by, that public school bus is pick you up and drop you off at Central Point to go to the non-public school. And we've added that to the charter school law. It's not used as frequently as we would like, so transportation continues to be a problem. And I would argue that's one of the things the choice movement needs to really work on. In Indianapolis, Indianapolis charter schools that are chartered by the mayor require a transportation plan. So part of the plan for a charter has to be transportation for parents to get their students to school.
So Anna, I know you have thought about this issue. What are some of the ideas out there for creating an adequate transportation system in a choice-based environment?
Yeah, school transportation is costly and it's complicated. If we break it down per pupil, it's about $932 per pupil per year, which is not insignificant. And states have taken different approaches. The chairman brings up a good example there for Indiana. So you can participate in the state-funded transportation plan, but only if your path from home to school will align with an existing bus route. And there's 31 states in total that currently have some kind of funding or services for students in charter schools to access those transportation type services. But I think it is very important to talk about because those restrictions can make choice untenable. And it's not just that it's a restriction for low-income families, but as these programs like Indiana's program grow to target also middle-income families, they can find themselves blocked from the exercise of choice because they're feeling that burden of self-financing the transportation. So I think there's tough political questions there. And it's a question of, well, we have a mandate not just to educate, but to transport our students to the different types of schools, whether they are district, charter, or other forms of choice.
So Matt, this is a good question for the Urban Institute's Center on Data and Policy, because transportation is a big issue out there that I think is understudied by the academic community. Do you have any thoughts on this?
So we actually did a big study on this a couple of years ago, worked with researchers who had data on where students live and where they go to school in 5 cities with a lot of choice. And those are places that vary a lot. And one of the most interesting things was just how different the transportation policies are. So in Washington, D.C., where I live, the choice system, I think 75% of kids go to a school that's not their neighborhood school, but it's got to be a school close by or a place they can get on by a parent with a car or public transportation, because the city provides free passes for the bus and the subway, but there's no school bus system for regular education students. New Orleans is the polar opposite of that policy. In New Orleans, you can go to any school, right? Any charter school in the city, they're all charter schools, and they provide a yellow bus for you to get there, and every school does that individually. New York City is more of a hybrid. The district manages the transportation. There are certain rules depending on who gets it. So it really varies a lot. And I agree with the chairman's comments that can have a big impact on whether choice is just a choice on paper or whether it's a choice in reality, especially for students whose families either don't have access to a car, don't have the resources to use public transportation, or just don't have the time to be, especially with a younger child, traveling with that child each day to and from school.
Well, one of the things that few people realize is that the U.S. Supreme Court back in 1949 decided in the Everson case that you could transport kids to religious schools without violating the First Amendment. That's one of the exceptions to the general rule that the government cannot aid a religious school directly. It was decided that the transportation was not a religious activity. It was sort of a secular activity that could be financed by the state. So there's absolutely no reason that's a good law today, and there's no reason at all why you can't have a comprehensive transportation system that hauls any kid who's going to any school anywhere within a particular district and have it operated by one comprehensive system. To me, that implies this is a state function. This is something that the state could finance and doesn't need to be imposed on the local property tax. And that way you could get more broader support for a common transportation system. And I am influenced by Boston, which indeed has that kind of system, and it actually works really well, although that's a pretty expensive thing for the school district to bear.
Well, one other thing I heard on this point from New Orleans is apparently a lot of the charters down there don't want a systematic approach to transportation. They see the experience of going to their school as starting from when the kids step on the bus to when they get home. And they want to create that experience, and they don't want those other kids from some other charter school down the street maybe being on that bus. So just more of an anecdote than data, but just an interesting story of, I'm sort of with you from a kind of efficiency standpoint. You should have one system of transportation, no reason to make individual schools do that. But I guess you might get some pushback from some schools of choice there.
Wayne, do you have a thought?
Just one thought on the equity conversation. I want to second the point Chairman Behning made first, and everyone has agreed. And in order to truly have choice, kids have to have a way to get there. So not providing a mechanism for kids to get to school is not truly providing choice for kids. The second point.
Sorry, Wayne, go ahead.
Only other brief thing I wanted to say is I hope we get to the place soon where we disentangle the conversation about equity in schools from one about racial diversity in schools. Because we oftentimes, especially when we talk about charter schools and this conversation about charter schools, conversation about racial segregation, we spend more time talking about how many Black kids and white kids are in the same class than we do about the quality of reading instruction or mathematics instruction provided to kids in the classroom. And if we're serious about having a conversation about equity, then the core of equity is around the quality of instruction and the quality of resources that are provided for kids. There's no magic that happens when a kid of one race sits next to a kid of another race and then you just get phonics. There's other important things that happen by them being in the same space, but it's not learning to read and do math.
Two follow-ups from the audience. One is across the, just anyone from the panel could jump in. One is about athletics. How do we think about school choice in the context of athletics, and maybe how does Indiana think about that? And then how are there places around the country where they've gotten creative about the athletics part of the school experience?
Actually, our Indiana High School Athletic Association was somewhat helpful in our choice discussion because to be able to participate in statewide high school athletics, you had to be an accredited non-public or public school. So when it came to accountability, our voucher schools generally were part of IHSAA and fit in very easily. So athletics really has not been a challenge for us at all. And Indiana is a big athletic state, especially basketball, football. So it's not been a challenge for our non-public schools, our choice schools in most cases.
Anything from the research on the athletic component of school choice and how it influences it?
I don't, but I do want to follow up on Wayne's comment about equity, and I think it's worth pointing out, because this follows up also with the chairman's comment about the money savings from choice reverting back to the district. And we did a study of the competitive effects of Indiana's voucher program and found no harm that was resulting from the program expanding. And so I think that's worth pointing out, that if we're talking about equity of outcomes, well, across all sectors, an expansion of choice, even as big as the nation's largest voucher program like you have in Indiana, doesn't seem to have a negative effect on the students who are non-choosers, the students who are left behind. So I think that's worth pointing out.
Well, in the Boston area, the athletic program has been a big part of the Metro program because the suburban school districts all want all these talented minority athletes that live in Boston to come out to the suburbs and lead their teams to victory on the football field or the basketball court. So actually, it's actually been used to, it seems to me, to use school choice in a way that's not been sort of generally available to people, but have been used to, for very particular interests by school districts. So, it's a big question, the athletic, because a lot of people care a lot about their athletic program at a school. A lot of people care that they keep the good, talented athletes at their school and don't go off to another school. So, yeah, it's a good question, and I don't think the scholars have a very good answer to it.
Paul, I know we're close to time, but one last quick lightning round question from the audience. Did the people on the panel, and from a research perspective or from a governmental perspective, consider a student who enrolls in their neighborhood school to be a non-chooser?
I don't.
Yeah, can you have a comment?
Yeah, I think it's more nuanced than that, and I'll use the personal example. My daughter attends the local district school, but we are absolutely choosers because we bought that house based on that school.
And that is the last word. We have run out of time. So thank you all for joining us today.